Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Respecting the Beer. My name is Gary Arndt, and with me, we have another distinguished panel. We have the gold medal winning brewer from the Great International Beer Competition, Bobby Fleshman. How are you doing?
Very well. Thanks, Gary.
Quite an accomplishment, might I add.
Yeah, I just learned that our Spanish competition was pretty steep.
Yeah, they're like a legit, serious brewery.
Fantastic. Yeah.
We also have the Sage of Suds, Mr. Joel Hermansen. And we have a special guest that has come all the way around the world to be with us today at McFleshman's Brewery. And Joel, you've known this man far longer than me. Why don't you do the honors to introduce him?
Yeah, I am privileged to know this man. Those of you who've been in the brewery, sometimes we get confused with one another because of our flowing gray locks. We are, of course, joined this afternoon by Bielefeld's own Christoph Karck.
Yeah, guten Morgen. Thanks for having me. Vielen Dank.
So one of the reasons we have you on the show is that this episode, we want to talk about something that we have referenced many different times, the German purity law known as the Reinheitsgebot. You have a copy of this downstairs in the pub, hanging on the walls. You could argue that this law was maybe in some ways the beginnings of the beer industry, in that it started to put some rails or at least define what beer is.
For sure. Yeah, we have both versions, a 15-16 version, which we were trying to open in 2016 for that reason, but we missed it by about a year. And then we have the more modern version, which is
1873.
1873. So yeah, they're both on the wall.
This has been edited so many times.
Yeah.
You're bound to run into an anniversary at some point.
Oh, that's true.
It's like a broken clock being right twice a day.
Yep.
So, Christoph, could you do us the honors and read to us the original text in German of the original Reinheitsgebot?
Happy to do it. Ganz besonders wollen wir, dass forthin allenthalben in unseren Städten, Märkten und auf dem Lande zu keinem Bier mehr Stücke als allein Gersten, Hopfen und Wasser verwendet und gebraucht werden sollen. So, Gersten is barley, Hopfen is hops, and Wasser is water.
And now Joel's going to say the same thing. He's going to repeat what you just said. No, we won't put the audience through that.
No, I think whatever listenership we had would vanish if I were to.
It's certainly our German base,
right?
So, Joel, what is this, and why was it created? What was the impetus behind it?
Well, I'd like to start off by pointing out that the version from which Christoph just read is the 1516 version, and this has been edited on a number of occasions. And it's also not the first version. I think sometimes we think that this maybe was the beginning of this. It actually wasn't. This is the first provincial purity law. Cities, for example, had their own purity law. Munich had one as far back as 1487. So the Bavarian purity law likely came from that, was likely influenced from that. I think we should also make a note of what the goal of this document was. So I'm going to read from an English translation. In particular, we decree that henceforth in our towns, markets, and in the countryside, nothing but barley, hops, and water shall be used to brew beer. Anyone who knowingly violates this decree shall be punished by the court for having each of these beer barrels removed from their possession. I feel like that's a steep consequence for violating this particular policy. So the purpose of this is to obviously have beer that is pure, that is brewed with the most fundamental of ingredients. And this has been something that, frankly, Europeans have been doing for some time. The Romans actually had food purity laws dating all the way back to, well before even the establishment of the Roman Empire. So this is nothing new for Europe to have a purity law. For example, the Romans used to eat they still do, but a fish sauce called garum. And garum is basically where you take a bunch of mackerel You put it in a clay pot and you leave it in the sun for 6 to 9 months, and it turns into this gelatin type substance that is remarkably salty. It's almost like you're just eating salt. But they had purity laws that you could only use certain types of fish and things like that. So this really kind of builds on a longer tradition of food purity laws in Europe.
So what were they trying to avoid? What would people be putting in beer that would require this? Are
Well,
they making hazy IPAs? Are they making, what?
right. There's going to be a couple of motivating factors that are related to this. One of them was, and this is where this kind of gets into Reformation politics a little bit, and it's something that we've talked about here on the show before, and Bobby has talked about this on a couple of occasions as well. In the Catholic world, they would spice and accentuate the taste of beer with herbal seasonings, which was called a gruit. Do you remember talking about that? Those mixes that they used
I don't
to put
remember.
in there?
I think bog myrtle was brought up.
Yes.
A few other ingredients, but yeah, there was a time in which it was all called. Was it called ale, right? And gruit until hops were employed, and then it became beer in the English culture.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if you think about using something like this, where you just have I don't know if they use some sort of like a muslin bag for this, but you just have this bag of aromatics.
Most of these were not poisonous that they used.
Right.
I think over time they vetted out which ones were. But
Right.
yeah.
And you could never produce a beer that had any, consistent, replicable quality about it. It was just kind of this hodgepodge. You never knew what you were going to get in this gruit thing. So Martin Luther actually was amongst the first Germans to attack that industry and say, nope, we need to use the noble hops in brewing. They need to be German. And I'm going to turn to Christoph on this, but I think the Germans are pretty into consistency and to be able to replicate something so that it.
And the noble here means the heirloom varieties that were not bred together and so forth. These are the original, the
Right.
OGs. Yep.
Right. Am I wrong in saying that in the German culture there's a
standardization and consistency is probably a hallmark of our background. I think that's fair to say.
and you're not going to produce that consistency, that standardization if you're using inconsistent ingredients. So I think that there's a cultural quality at play here. I think at one level there's price control qualities. This is at a time in German history where we are about a decade or so before the German peasant revolt of the 1520s. And that was a 3 or 4 year period in which there was a chaos in Germany, particularly in the countryside, that we do not associate with Germans. For example, if you know Christoph, there's no chaos in Christoph. I mean, there's a CH in his name, but there's no chaos there. And this was a very difficult time in German history. So one of the ways that you're going to solve that problem is if you can control the price of beer. And the only way that you can do that is if you have, either, very rigid, strict taxation policies, or if you have, price controls that are based on the standardization of ingredients. So I think that is obviously one thing. You're trying to prevent gouging.
This wasn't universal. There were exceptions to this, weren't there?
Before we get to that, let me give you the other, yes, there were. Let me give you the other two purposes. Grain shortages. And this leads us into your question. The German purity law at its core had as a fundamental goal to try and, because of those aforementioned peasant challenges, to try and limit the use of wheat in brewing. And hence the inclusion of...
Use it all for bread.
Right. Because you're having a food scarcity issue. What better way to solve that than by insisting that beer only be brewed with barley, and there might be some variance at this table, but I would agree that is the only way that beer should be brewed myself. So yes, there was one exception, and Bobby, I know you've talked about this exception before with this one family. I'll let you take that one.
Well, I don't remember their name. Maybe you have it in front of you, but I know that there was some relationship with
the Wittelsbach.
There you go. The powers that be that allowed them sort of the monopoly on the wheat beer. And wheat beer could be, I think, eventually licensed out at a price through the same powers. But they were granted, I think, free reign. And I don't remember their names. You said that just now, but
I think I mispronounced it. So we're going to go over to the guide for this.
What, the Wittelsbach?
The Wittelsbach.
There we go.
Yes.
So it does speak to some politics or manipulation of the system.
Right.
Yeah, for sure.
Because the Bavarian version was created by the regional leader, Duke Wilhelm.
Right.
Is the creator of this, and because at this point in the German political history. And again, if you know your Reformation history, one of the reasons that the Reformation took off so quickly in Germany is because it gave local dukes, princes, and nobility the opportunity to kind of create a small little kingdom for themselves and to run that. So at the time of unification in the 1870s, Germany was actually made up of several hundred principalities. So to have this sort of a law, makes perfect sense. And as Bobby said, there's a certain amount of, dare I say, political intrigue in how these exceptions were carved out. Because as we're going to see, in particular when we review a very interesting court case later that challenged some of the integrity of this law, there were a few exceptions. So
anyone who's listened to this show long enough knows that there is an important ingredient missing from this original version.
Oh, yes.
This has barley, hops, and water.
Yep.
And if you just took those three things, you could not make beer, actually.
If we only had a brewer to talk about this.
What is the pronunciation? God is gut. I think there was something written later on that allowed it to be amended and included. Yeast, that is. Yeah.
Pronunciations.
Maybe if we had that version of the Reinheitsgebot in front of us. But from the brewer standpoint, they all knew it was an ingredient, a sort of sludge that would be transferred from one batch to the next. Whether it was actually detailed on the list of allowable ingredients, they would just not clean their primary vessels out so well. And so in the back door, they were adding yeast without having to actually add yeast because the yeast were multiplying and being passed down from one batch of beer to the next. They may not have understood the microbiology, but they knew that whatever this thing was necessary to make the beer be beer. What would it taste like? I have that note on my sheet here. A beer made with only these three ingredients. I assume we mean including yeast in this question. Well, that's what we have today, right? We have hops, barley, water, and yeast today. What would this version of beer taste like? I think that's maybe what we're suggesting in this comment.
No, if you took yeast out of it.
Oh, if you took yeast out of it. Okay. Well, first of all, they wouldn't have the ability to remove yeast. They would come along for the ride. It would be everywhere. They didn't have a sense of the microbiology. It would take a lot longer to ferment out. And it would ferment out unbridled by not only yeast, but also bacteria, which would yield acid. And it would be a very sour beer.
Move over.
Yeah.
Hi, Allison Fleshman here. I'm sitting in the back, and we have limited microphones, and so I just have to jump in. Bobby, he's wanting you to say it's going to taste like crap. If there's no yeast, it's going to taste like crap.
Right. It wouldn't be beer. It would be beer. It would be uncontrolled. We can talk about the Belgian approach to brewing, but that's a different episode. In this case, yes, without yeast, you lose control entirely. Yeah.
So if they're pursuing, I'm just going to play the devil's advocate. If they're pursuing standardization,
yeah,
it seems like they actually moved farther from standardization with the exclusion of yeast.
I think they were always including the yeast. Like I said,
they didn't know it existed.
They knew that whatever was remaining after they transfer a beer out of its original tank, where it ferments, that had to be left in part behind. So yeah.
Would that not be incredibly sour? If
Well,
they just continue
okay,
to use...
now we're talking about the pressures of evolution on the yeast strains. So the brewery is putting pressures on these yeast, right? It's giving them the conditions that we have ordained that make the best beers. So some of these yeast die off over time. Bacteria can't survive in that level of alcohol, hopping levels, CO2 levels, all these things come into the equation. And really, you only have one organism that's made for this occasion, and that's what we call brewer's yeast today. And it was evolved out of these German brew houses early on. This is before the lager story, by the way. But the methodology is already in place to eventually give way to the lager brewing a couple of 100 years ago. Yeah. So we put environmental pressures on yeast, and we made them evolve into the strain that could outcompete those bacteria. So eventually, yes, but initially, probably not so awesome. And your third bullet here as to why we had the Reinheitsgebot, it was to avoid this souring. And I don't know if we talked about the seasonality, the rules on seasonality of brewing, but that's also part of this whole rule system too. Because if you brew in the summer months, you tend to pick up more bacteria and you lose control of your process. So they would tend to brew in the cooler months of the year to avoid that.
Would Gary like a beer brewed in 1516?
I doubt it.
I don't think anybody would like a beer brewed in 15, 16.
And
We've talked about this. I don't think that many beers and ales from that period would be well liked.
I don't think the Reinheitsgebot was made so as to preserve what was happening. It was created, from this point of view, to improve what was being created. So it wasn't awesome. I don't think it was good at all. I think this was part of the reason that they instigated.
Maybe you can tackle one and call it 1515 and...
Yeah, maybe we should.
1515 ale.
That's pretty good. I think New Belgium has one from an abbey called 1615. So I think we're okay on
Could you brew a beer with just those three core ingredients?
Absolutely. We do. We actually already do.
Which one?
Berliner Weiss. We
It
already
doesn't have
do.
yeast in it?
Nope. We finish it with yeast, but trust me, it doesn't change it to any great degree. 99% of the work is done by bacteria on the grain. We already do that.
Okay, that is a subject for a different...
We'll have to talk about that.
We like to call it Berliner Weisse.
Berliner Weissen, yeah.
Okay, wow,
Yeah.
that is already as close as it gets, is what
Yes.
you say.
Yep. That's as close to before we knew of yeast that the Germans had, that I know of, got to brewing.
Christoph, by the way, is such a tremendous asset during the summer season when our Hefeweizen is on tap, because he'll stand at the bar and people will come up and order.
Zuterbräu.
And there's invariably, some people will say, can I have a Sutterbräu? Can I have a Sutterbrau? And then Christoph is always there to...
Yeah, but Bobby, you had it really good. Already.
I've only practiced. Yeah.
Sutterbräu is
Yeah.
really good.
Can you say Hefeweizen?
Hefeweizen?
Yeah.
That right there. That
But I see that note on our list. The last name Hefner, right?
Yes.
It shows up.
So that's a great point. And I was actually proud that I stumped the German on this one.
Yeah, I have never heard the word Hefner before.
So
But Hefe is, of course, the word for yeast.
Right.
So the job of this person was to actually go, and again, there's a social element in this. So this person, and I'm going to ask for the German pronunciation yet
Hefner.
again, the Hefner, would go into what I think we would characterize, and Christoph and I have brewed together, not nearly obviously as successful as Bobby has, but you're always left with a sedimenty, oatmeal consistency gruel, kind of a thing at the bottom that is oftentimes dumped out. And when you're brewing in larger quantities, the purpose of the Hefner was to kind of squeeze out what little liquid they could and to put that into barrels, and that would continue to ferment, and then that would be given to the poorest Germans as their beer. And then the solid mass that they were left over with, and I would be really interested in the technology as to were they using strainers, or like a colander. I don't know. I haven't been able to find anything out about that. But then what they were left with, this kind of sedimenty vegetal cake, would be reused in brewing. And I'm assuming that's where some of those natural yeasts and bacteria lived.
Yeah. Again, I think that was just another way of repitching and imposing those environmental pressures on those evolutions and the evolution of those strains.
Fascinating.
Yeah. They didn't know anything about microbiology, but they knew something about process, for sure.
Well, eventually they did learn about microbiology, and the law was eventually updated to include yeast because that's what beer is. I think this was in the 19th century when
Right.
they recognized yeast. But there was also some other stuff that happened in the 19th century. There was a very interesting court case that involved the Reinheitsgebot. And Joel,
Yes.
why don't you explain this, because this is a good one.
Yeah, and I'm going to ask for Christoph and Bobby to comment on this. So I'm going to read part of a court case that happened shortly after the unification of Germany in 1871, when the Bavarian Higher Regional Court of Nuremberg, did I pronounce that right?
Nuremberg, up there, Franconia.
Okay, acquitted a brewer who was charged with selling spoiled beer. So again, the whole purpose of this court case is to prevent spoilage and to have some standardization, et cetera. And the spoilage came from an odd source. The brewer had accidentally dropped a cat.
That's quite an excellent.
I wish this podcast had Allison's
Bobby,
face
that
when I
happens to
just
you
read that.
frequently?
Somehow on the, if we could get that on the, David, can we get that on the website? We can, good. The cat fell into the mash tun, was killed, and dissolved into the beer. The Bavarian court stated that it was legally irrelevant that the consumption of such beer might cause disgust or emotional damage. So that was the initial case. Now, I think if we just, and I'll give you guys a chance to chime in on this in a second, but initially I'm not feeling real good about that decision, but there was an appellate court that intervened. On appeal, the Reichsgericht, how did I do on that?
Very good.
Oh, wow. Or the Imperial Court of Justice reversed the Bavarian court's ruling and held that the beer was indeed spoiled. It stated that the lower court could determine what constituted spoiled beer only if it defined normal beer, and that it should have inquired whether cat residue is a normal ingredient in beer. It sarcastically questioned why the lower court cited testimony from an expert witness who claimed that the boiling of animals such as rats and mice was frequent and unavoidable, if it did not mean to suggest that animals are unusual ingredients of beer. Christoph, we're going to start with you. You're the German at the group. Does this seem consistent with German laws, the legal traditions?
Yeah, I'm not an expert on German law, but it is striking how bad this looks right now. And if we look at our own courts here these days, yeah, it's unsettling, I would say.
Bobby, if you're thinking of making a cat lager, I got a cat guy. We can hook you up. We can make this happen.
Yeah, I'm curious of the word dissolved.
Yeah, that was my next question
would it
for
take?
you. What brewing?
What kind of enzymes and acids were involved?
What is this going to do to a beer? If you dissolve a cat in it.
Well, we often at the end of a brew day will put bratwurst into spent mash, spent grain, and cook it, just because it holds sous vide the bratwurst. So we have some experience doing this, but it's nothing to do with what ends up in the finished beer. This is what the product that goes to the cattle. But en route to that, we cook our lunches in the spent grain.
What is that?
It just cooks it.
I feel like that would be really good.
It's really good. It's 160 degrees, and it holds it for 4 hours, sous vide it, and then you
Why
have.
aren't you selling this?
I know. I tell the guys we should put more of these in, sell them.
To
Yeah.
our listeners, Gary's face lit up more than Allison's did at the dissolution of a cat into a beer.
So that's
Gary, what are your thoughts on the bratwurst sous vide in spent grain? Please, sir.
yeah.
This would revolutionize bratwurst in a land of bratwurst. This is totally something you should be doing. This is
We should pair it up with
just like this great brewer who by accident invented cat beer. You've invented, I think, a new form of bratwurst.
I heard it from somebody else. I don't know where I can offer that credit to, but it wasn't us.
Oh, and I would be remiss because, Christoph, I've been eating brats for my entire life, and I have stated that you, as a German, you speak bratwurst. I don't even know what it is, but you do a brilliant job cooking brats. Your thoughts on this methodology? You also look eager.
Well, it depends on what kind of brat are you using. For example, I'm only using pre-cooked,
Right.
brats of
No,
the
these
shelf. Really,
these
nothing.
won't be. They'll be uncooked, and after that length of time, they're very much.
And
cooked.
we haven't even talked about the German bratwurst purity laws, the Reinheitsgebot.
Yeah, that's a whole nother story.
Where they don't put things like gummy bears in it.
Right. There is only like a plain brat and nothing else. And you drive up here, you see the signs, 70 varieties of brats in a store at Suamico.
Yeah.
And I shudder by that.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Of course.
That said, not to throw Jacob's Meat Market under the bus, they do a gummy bear one, but they also do an amazing set of traditional ones too.
Well, if no one else is gonna do it, I'm gonna speak up for the gummy bear brat.
Yeah, you do that.
Because when you grill that thing and those gummy bears, much like the aforementioned cat, when those dissolve
Yeah.
in the brat,
Yeah.
it gives off like a maple syrup vibe.
Yeah.
It's absolutely extraordinary. Why is it we can have a jalapeno cheddar brat and celebrate it, but a gummy bear brat is frowned upon?
And now that I think about it, the bratwurst is German, right?
Yeah.
The gummy bear, Haribo,
Oh,
is
yeah.
of course
Right.
German. Maybe
Yeah,
it
yeah.
is a match
Maybe
made
it-
in heaven. And
Is
never
jalapeno
tried.
and cheddar German, Christoph?
cheddar you might find. Jalapenos you
Yeah,
would
but
be
putting
hard-pressed.
Pepsi and beer together is also German, so I don't think that necessarily
Well,
means
I was
that
going
it-
to say the Reinheitsgebot.
Now it's getting-
It details how we make these things, but it doesn't really have much to say about how we serve them. We end up making like these radlers where we blend it with grapefruit soda or any kind of soda, and we put all kinds of fruit juices into a finished Berliner Weisse, right? There's all these things we do at the end of the day that don't adhere to the Reinheitsgebot on the production side. So there is a contradiction here in philosophy when you look at it in those terms. Also, you're kind of hitting upon the whole spirit of the debate in the brewing world between the Reinheitsgebot people and the non-Reinheitsgebot people.
Let's put the bratwurst discussion aside for a moment, which I do believe this would be a brilliant idea. Just one night, just do this.
Okay, all right. Put it in the back pocket.
Let's move to today. How many beers?
How do we dissolve a cat? Yeah, back to that.
We have a lot more to say on the Reinheitsgebot, but that's going to conclude this episode of Respecting the Beer. Make sure to subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast player so you'll never miss an episode. And feel free to join the Facebook group to get updates between the episodes and to support the show over on Patreon. Links to both of these are in the show notes. And until next time, please remember to respect the beer.
Who knew we would end up on dissolving cats?
Who knew?
Joel, he wrote it down.
Yeah, I wrote that
I know.